Hello, I am John David Ebert, and welcome to class number 5 in Understanding Contemporary Art. In this class, we will look at the second half of Jackson Pollock's oeuvre, especially looking at the drip paintings, the action paintings, where Pollock begins to move. As we saw last time, Pollock now begins to move into an abstract, non-figurative space with the sacrifice of the body of the Great Mother and the carving of her up into pieces. What I want to start by doing is to discuss the significance of the move that Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner undertook in 1945 when they left New York City to move out to the famous barn, the house with the barn on Fireplace Road in Long Island in 1945, where Pollock stopped drinking for a couple of years. And during that period, long about 1947, he began to create the famous drip painting. So this is the great period of his great creative breakthrough. Now, one of the aspects of this that gets overlooked is the ontological significance of the status that this move reveals here. In a certain respect, though the exile from New York City was self-imposed in Pollock's case, he moved himself from the city to the countryside, it sort of symbolically prefigures the status, the ontological shift in the status of the artist in this new epoch of contemporary art that is on the way here, where the contemporary artist is, in a certain respect, has become dangerously superfluous to civilization now. I think that the role that used to be occupied by art has been taken over by the culture industry. By this time, by the 1940s, after World War II, the culture industry has come in with film and television and radio, and now we have the internet and comic books and so forth. All of that has taken over the role of the civilization-building qualities. We look for our anthropological types and our imaginary significations from those media. They shape civilization the way that art used to do. And so contemporary art, high art in other words, is in a status that is now dangerously superfluous. Civilization no longer needs this art in a certain respect. There's a certain leisure aspect to it. And Pollock's move from the city to the countryside sort of prefigures the ontological change whereby the city no longer needs the artist, and so the artist now is out on the globe everywhere. We get, Bruce Nauman at his ranch in New Mexico. We get James Turrell at Rodden Crater in Flagstaff, Susan Rothenberg out at her ranch. And the ontological status of the artist has changed in some cases to that even of a criminal, as with Banksy, who has to get in under the radar to draw his graffiti on the walls of the city. The artist is now regarded with suspicion. I think the same can probably be said also of the contemporary philosopher. The contemporary postmodern philosopher has largely suffered the same fate. The general culture, the general public at large regards the philosopher and the artist now with a certain degree of skepticism and suspicion. They now have to justify themselves and their existence and their undertaking and their vocation in a way that simply wasn't the case before in these previous phases of civilization. So now what I want to do is to look at these paintings that Pollock comes up with at this time. This first one here is called Composition with Pouring 2 from 1943, and it's an early prefiguration before the move to Fireplace Road of the non-figurative cosmos that he's going to move into here. It's still very tentative. It's not a fully successful painting yet, but it already foreshadows the kind of universe that he's going to move into. The real breakthrough, I think, comes with, or at least the first big breakthrough, comes with the Guggenheim mural that he painted in January 1944 for Peggy Guggenheim. And this mural really is quite amazing. It initially began as Pollock painting a series of animal forms, bison and horses crashing into each other. But the end result is that one can no longer recognize those forms because we have a dissolution and liquefaction of forms here in Pollock's art. It is an art that is very appropriate for the age of what Zygmunt Bauman calls liquid modernity, in which all the forms, not just the art forms, but the technological forms, the civilizational forms, the social forms, jobs, roles, genders, everything is in a state of continual liquefaction. And so Pollock is already moving into this phase space, the age of liquid modernity, and the art that he comes up with here is perfectly appropriate to the age of the continual meltdown of forms, whereby the hapless individual is constantly besieged with so much change that he or she can barely keep head above water with all the changes that are going on. Now notice that another aspect of the Guggenheim mural is that there is no privileged point of view here. This is not a perspectival work from the age of perspectival art or even modernist art anymore. Pollock is moving out of modernist art into a new period here. This is a kind of what Gilles Deleuze would call a rhizomatic work. And a rhizome is simply a non-hierarchical sort of plateau, like the rhizomes under the ground between trees that get all tangled up with the roots, where there is no hierarchy. One does not climb the tree in the rhizome to look out on a single perspective at everything else. The rhizome is composed of multiple entry points. One can enter the rhizome from any point of view at any point. There is no privileged point of view. And also there is a sense in which the sense of sight has been stepped down with this art and the sense of touch has been stepped up. This is a very haptic, tactile work. You can almost feel it. Pollock is beginning to use his eye as an extension of the hand here. And there's a direct line, I think, from Pollock's work to the artwork of H.R. Giger. This is H.R. Giger's biomechanical landscape. And Giger, too, creates works that are a densely woven intermeshwork of a biomechanical landscape whereby there is no privileged point of view. This is not a perspectival art. It's an art of the hand. The hand is sort of indifferent to what it touches. It does not privilege any single point of view. And in a sense, this is going back at the end of civilization to its beginning. If we look at this image of Viking art, we again see here that this was largely a non-visual art in the sense that the eye was not privileged, the hand was privileged. It was a tactile art, a densely interwoven meshwork of this kind of tactile looping and interweaving like a tapestry. The same thing goes for this page out of the Lindisfarne Gospels here. I think Pollock is returning on the turn of the spiral back to the pre-perspectival epoch before the 15th century that characterized the birth of Western European art, where the hand was privileged over the eye, and this was an absolutely non-perspectival form of art. Now, it was indeed here in 1947, this is Lucifer of 1947, that Pollock achieved the breakthrough at Fireplace Road into an absolutely non-visual, totally textural work of art. This is a horizontal work that has the vast, encompassing expansiveness of the American landscape to it. All these paintings were painted indoors inside of a barn, a sort of polyphemus cavern, inside which Pollock painted these images, a little bit like the Paleolithic artist painting the images on the walls of his cave, only here, as we've said, he's painting on the ground, in a certain sense using the earth as his canvas. This is a vertical example from this period, 1947. This is called Full Fathom 5. And again, it has this sense where no part of the painting is privileged over any other part of the painting. You could cut a slice from it, and a part would stand almost holographically for the whole of the image here. It doesn't matter which part of the image you're looking at or which way you approach it. This is Untitled Green Silver from 1949. This is another one of his haptic paintings in which we have an interwoven dense meshwork. And in a certain sense here, as we follow Pollock's work, we can see that forms are dissolving into the liquid matrix of self-organization from noise, as the chaos philosophers and theoreticians call it, out of which signals always come out of noise. You have static first, you have background radiation before you have the cosmos, you have static or noise first before you have a clear signal. And in the theory of morphogenesis, as put forth by Gilles Deleuze in his book Difference in Repetition, there is always noise, and noise is this realm of undifferentiated intensivities that gradually self-organize to the point where forms then later emerge out of them. And if you rewound Jackson Pollock's art, if you started with these later paintings and went backwards, you would have a perfect example then of noise preceding self-organization with forms morphogenetically slowly pulling themselves out with the Guggenheim mural, and then with the later images that we saw like Pasiphae, you would see the forms coming into being from out of this protogenetic matrix. Here is Autumn Rhythm, which is probably the masterpiece of this entire epoch of Pollock's work. This is Autumn Rhythm from 1950. And the other grand masterpiece from this period, I think, is Lavender Mist, which is an amazing painting to stand in front of. It's just simply absolutely entrancing. But it has a quality to it of white noise, almost as though Pollock were painting the electromagnetic sphere of white noise that surrounds the Earth. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, interestingly enough, was at about this time creating purely electronic music out of the degradation of white noise into colored sound. At right about this time, right about 1950, he was working on his earliest electronic compositions based on white noise. And here I think there is a certain aspect in which Pollock is not only capturing the curvature of the space-time aspect surrounding the Earth, but also the electromagnetic noise that surrounds it. Then we have the decline of Pollock's artwork. He began drinking again, and then he went back to the artwork in 1951 and began producing these black and white images, which I think are inferior works of art. For one thing, Pollock's major strength had to do with color. Color, he knew how colors fit together better than almost anyone, and to begin painting these works without color was, I think, a degradation and a decline for him, and I think he knew it, and the drinking began to intensify. Part of the problem was that in 1949, Pollock's image avatar, as we see here in the pages of Life magazine, which asks the question, is he the greatest living painter in the United States, began to gigantify him in creating an image avatar of the likes of Elvis Presley or James Dean. He was sort of seen now as the sort of Marlon Brando of the art world, or the Ernest Hemingway of the art world. And his image avatar rather began to grow larger and larger, and it destabilized his psyche. His paintings had begun to grow larger and larger over time, and they had begun to dwarf him ontologically. But now with his success in the media and the media generation of him as a great, grand avatar, his image of himself as the greatest living painter on the planet began to magnify his ego, and it sort of dwarfed him and destabilized him, so that when Hans Nemeth came to Fireplace Road in 1950 to film him with his documentary, which was very artificial, very contrived, and very much staged to present him as the great suffering, romantic, lonely painter. In that documentary, we see Pollock outdoors when he never painted outdoors. We see him putting his shoes on in a certain way, learning to stand in a cinematic way. Hans Nemeth destabilized him, I think, in that video, and it sent him crashing into a period of self-doubts, and it started his decline as an artist. The image dynamics of the electronic image and the avatar through the media began to destabilize his sense of self, and I think over time it led to his sort of death by suicide by car crash, almost as a sort of imitation of the death of James Dean. And so that wraps it up for Jackson Pollock. Those are the main features of Pollock's art.